I hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com. So, what are some, or I guess kind of going more in depth with kind of key elements and roles and other kind of considerations that a central bank digital currency would kind of provide? What would questions that would arise, right? How exactly would it be designed and structured, right? It's kind of the topic of the video. And so going back to the reports done, it was a series of collaborations between a group of central banks. So this includes like the Bank of Canada, the ECB, the BOJ, the Swiss National Bank, the Bank of England, um, obviously the Board of Governors for the Federal Reserve, and also, even though it's not technically a central bank, the Bank for International Settlements, to get kind of an international body in there as well. They were all involved. This one is the kind of the beginning of the second report. We're going more in depth with the actual design for the system itself, not just like kind of like the core system for the currency and that kind of structure, but also just eventually getting into problems of interoperability, right? So like how can we have this currency interact, say, with cross-border payments, as an example, right? So with that being said, we'll head straight over to the screen share to the PDF for this report. And before I forget, I'll make it bigger so you guys can see it as well. Okay, and so this kind of system should be very similar, or it seems like it'll be similar with kind of the traditional one that we already have, right? And so you can kind of tell where um, throughout the reports and also some of the other like speeches and papers and stuff that I've read and done videos on in the past, a lot of the times I think there was one speech from a uh, district bank president for the Federal Reserve, and then one from the vice chair of the board of governors, I believe, specifically to CBDCs, right? And so you can kind of tell through just those sources and also just these reports in general and some of the other papers kind of where it's kind of weaving to, right? In terms of like how exactly would they implement it, what kind of structures are they going for, that kind of thing, right? And so you can kind of tell it's supposed to be, and it's even explicitly stated in this said report, to be more of a kind of a tiered system, much like the kind of our current banking system is for America, where you have kind of the central bank with the Federal Reserve, and then you kind of have the group of member banks, the commercial banks below that. So there's kind of two separate tiers. Kind of the same idea ish with the central bank digital currency, towards really like you have the central bank and then intermediaries that provide certain functions, and then below that, then you have the end users, the individuals and businesses that would actually be using said currency, right? And so, as always, you kind of have at the center of this ecosystem for a CBDC would have kind of like a cool rule book, kind of laying out the legal basis, the governance for it, risk management in general for the risks that said currency would provide, or the risks that would arise from implementing said CBDC, right? And also other requirements too. So like what intermediaries would have to do, specific kind of requirements for end users, whatever that may be, right? And so, like I said, intermediaries could include banks, payment service providers, mobile operators, and fintech or big tech companies, depending on the access policies set out in the core rulebook. This highlight, right? And so and as always, these are still just collaboration papers. Believe these were published in late 2020, I believe, maybe early 2021, depending on where you are in the series. And so, again, some progress has been made, but kind of want to start from the beginning and see how this has developed through time, right? Look at other reports as well. Okay, and so these rules would determine how different use cases work, including initiation, processing, fees and compensations, use of data and data protection, all things we've talked about in previous videos, right? And so intermediaries would use one or several processing infrastructures enabling payment messages to be processed, reconciled, and to access and communicate with the core infrastructure. It's really kind of the whole providing that intermediate service that they would have to provide, right? So specifically with like processing and stuff, because you have the central bank itself, and we'll even get into later where they stated explicitly to where they're like they don't have kind of that customer service and those kind of things. They don't have that experience. Like I don't think the Federal Reserve has like a customer service desk, really. At least not for regular people. Maybe for like member banks and stuff like that. But you'd assume that to be a member bank for it within the Federal Reserve System, you'd have to have some degree of competence at least. And so it'd be a much different dynamic. Whereas, like, if you want to have some random, I don't know, landscaper who has a question about why they can't use their card or whatever, they're probably not going to be able to go in depth with, say, like coding or um, privacy policies for a currency like this, right? Whatever it happens to be, right? And so basically, some of the responsibilities for these intermediaries would be like pre, during, and post transactions, right? So the whole thing for the most part, when how are you going to transfer this stuff? And so how they exactly say that. And so for pre transaction, this would include like onboarding, providing access devices and channels. So we talked about this in the technology video. Would it be like a flash drive that you're like able to transmit for? Is it just attached to your phone? Do you get your own card? This kind of like a tap to pay thing, something like that. The actual transaction itself is another thing to keep in mind, and this is where the customer service and support comes in. People trying to actually transact this thing. There's also, and then there's the post transaction, right? Which would be like advice, getting like a bank statement or billing statements and stuff like that. Kind of looking into the footnotes, specifically with the second one, which refers to like how things will communicate with core infrastructure. Um, Basically, I highlighted biometrics because it piqued my interest to see that in here. I don't know why I'm highlighting other stuff. I'm just giving like other things to really keep in mind. So, like, how would this processing happen? Like what would be performed. So like it says pre-checks, which would be like limit checks or funds availability. So like how you can at the ATM where you can check how much funds you actually have in your bank account, right? Something like that. Whether it be like authentication or verification, stuff like that. How would they do that? How would they authentify, I guess, a person to make sure that they're actually using it right or that they are who they say they are? And that's where kind of this biometrics comes into play. Again, footnotes, it's there, so I thought I'd point it out. Don't really want to go down some huge theory rabbit hole. Who knows? But getting more into like the core system itself, and so like what's kind of the rule book that they would have, and so they say the central bank could be a sole operator and or a broader governance arrangement could include public or industry governance bodies. So kind of like would it be the sole operator or more of like a supervisory committee? How just like how the board of governors was originally created, right? Before all of the amendments to the Federal Reserve Act, and I don't remember off the top of my head when or if that changed. It's just I've been reading Paul Warburg's book, like the origins of the Federal Reserve, and going through step by step both the Federal Reserve Act and the other pieces of proposed legislation beforehand. And so that was kind of an example that came to mind, right? Just kind of because I read it this morning. Um, Also, with respect to core infrastructure, so like how would issuing and redeeming said CBDC um, happen? It'd most likely be a core central bank function, right? Because the actual currency themselves, that's kind of where, in our case, in America, the Federal Reserve they have experience with, in a way, right? If you want to get into technicalities, we can do that in a separate video, right? Okay, for the broader ecosystem in general, you have processing infrastructure, which we kind of talked about before. So, a single processing infrastructure run by the central bank or outsourced to a third party could provide a level playing field for payment and processing service providers, right? Computer is about to take off. um, Fans were going crazy for a second. I had it charging. Okay. So to continue for processing services, so one of the possible roles or a proposal of the roles would be like to encourage innovation and efficiency, a variety and combination of private providers, which would be like banks, payment service providers, non-bank processors, tech companies, something else, other entities that could run the processing services, enabling their own payment services or those of others, right? Kind of letting a more capitalistic approach to it rather than a centralized entity dictating where things go, right? Sort of that thing, right? And so that's kind of, and this again goes into the more of the two-tiered system. I think we've talked about a bit earlier, to where it's much like you have the intermediaries, where it's like the second tier, and then you have the top tier where you have the central bank itself, which they each have different functions. It's basically like the core infrastructure and the currency itself would be run by, say, the Fed, right? And then basically they'd outsource all other services and things that would have to go along with that to other said intermediaries, whatever that case may be for whatever service it happens to be, right? Just to give an examples, right? And one of the things that they've been talking about in terms of like the language itself is because they've noted like how it can be, the terms themselves can be confusing. So they say like the difference between like token and account, they need more explanation on those, and whenever they'd communicate whatever. And so they give the difference of how they would define, say, like an account-based CBDC versus a token-based CBDC. And it's kind of like the focus. And so like an account-based one would be like towards like you have an account, and it's like how much of this have you been transacting? So you would be they would be supervising, for lack of a better term, a person's account and then measuring the flow of currency from there. Whereas like a token based version would be, say, like you have an individual token that's addressed to a certain person, say like by pointer or whatever it happens to be, um, to where that token is referenced to a certain person, and that's how they keep track of it. So are they tracking it are they tracking it via the account for the person or the individual like token, right? Kind of that idea, right? And so there's also different possible roles that could arise from this. And so, like, central banks would be the only entities entitled to issue and redeem a CBDC and would bear the ultimate responsibility for the design of the system and the operation slash oversight of the core ledger. It's that kind of line of thoughts. The reason why this series of reports is a collaboration between central banks. So keep in mind the source. Obviously, they're going to kind of think that that's their whole point. Um, but anyways, and so they also think of this kind of a form, which would be like they call it a direct CBDC system, where it's like you would go to, say, like the post office or some government office to deal with your things or whatever. If you have a problem, like, I guess from a customer service point of view, if you would not have some intermediary, you would go to like the post office, which is obviously has an amazing track record of being very efficient, um, at least from my experience, and just a little bit of sarcasm in there. But anyways, and part of this, one of the reasons why this might not be a good thing, or would probably not be the best idea, was central banks typically lack experience in customer service. They don't really have to deal with regular people on a, I mean, I guess you could argue the press conferences, but that's not really like a customer service sort of thing, right? And so there's other things that would be involved in that, but that's really, yeah, they even admit, um, although likely unsuitable for the central banks contributing to this report, for jurisdictions lacking adequate private payment provision for the public, a direct system could be appropriate. And so, yes, it could be appropriate, but they even start out with, although likely unsuitable, because they don't have that kind of experience before. They don't have to anyway, and that sort of thing. So the central banks contributing to this report, the ones we talked about in the beginning of the video, kind of envision this ecosystem. It would be based on broad public-private collaboration. This is that tiered system I was talking about, where you have the public kind of government more entity with the central bank and those stuff at the top, and then you have more of the private intermediaries in the bottom that would are kind of outsource the services and that sort of thing that would go to the end users, right? And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. And then you have kind of a depiction of it too, where you have the core ecosystem, where you have the currency itself and central bank and pictures that aren't labeled for some reason. And you have the broader ecosystem, which includes like the processing infrastructure and merchants and end users. So like how would you the people that would use it, and also like the intermediaries, right? That's pretty much it. So with that being said, I'm going to stop the screen share. So yeah, kind of big takeaways. Um, Most likely would be some form of two-tiered system, much like kind of our traditional, I guess, financial system is, or monetary system is at the moment, something along those lines. And yeah, probably have intermediaries. So you might still have to deal with your banks. Now, there are some arguments also posed in other forms that, I'm sorry, there are also questions in some kind of cost benefit analyses or analyses that you have to do in terms of other characteristics of such a central bank digital currency. For example, like whether or not it would be interest bearing, and then how much interest, and then how would that deal with, like, would they have to compete with commercial banks for deposits and things like that? Basically, how could you have a CBDC as kind of an auxiliary dollar-based asset that would not drain liquidity from the commercial banking system, right? And that is kind of a question they've posed multiple times throughout these reports, right? And some of the speeches have been through that about that as well, I believe. So yeah, definitely interesting and things to talk about. But with that being said, I'm going to leave this video here. So I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you on